Guten Nachmittag. How's that? I am ashamed to be one of those North Americans that only knows one language. There's no excuse. So I'm very impressed when I come to Europe and I see that people can understand, can speak many languages, and I just don't have the mind for it, so my apologies. I hope that you've been enjoying the Congress. I certainly have. I am very impressed with the organization and the speakers and the audience. The wisdom, that collective wisdom that's in this room is really quite striking. And I'm honored to be here to share with you some of my colleagues' work in North America. And I intend for this presentation to leave you with a sense of optimism that system transformation is possible, that it can be rewarding, and that it can even be exciting at times. So I wanted to share a little bit about why I'm here. And I don't mean here in Switzerland, but I mean here in this space, mental health space. And it's a very personal story. Throughout my life, I've been surrounded by people that have been very much challenged by mental illness, not only as a child, but continuing as an adult. I grew up very privileged, lower middle class, but white, heterosexual. So I had a lot of things going for me. And I didn't suffer a huge amount from mental illness. I have struggled with depression and have been treated for that, but it's nothing like what I've seen in the people around me. Many of the people around me were harmed by our broken mental health non-system. There is nothing systematic about how care is offered anywhere as I can see it in the world. So hopefully we can change that collectively. Holding the picture on the left is my brother, Harvey, my oldest sibling, a gifted history teacher. He's been labeled by some, including me at times, to my shame, an alcoholic. Long before that came to be, when I was a child, I idolized my brother, Harvey. Unfortunately, that changed when his alcoholism presented itself, and I was not in a community that helped me to navigate that. Despite his overuse of alcohol, he's a loving father of grown twin boys. His twin boys are also history teachers. So obviously he did something right because his boys followed his path in life. He's a talented self-made carpenter, an avid sailor, and an ever loyal sibling. My father, Richard, who died a little over 10 years ago, he's in the picture that my brother is holding. And he's holding this because he realized when he turned 60 years old at this time, he was starting to look a lot like my father, who was much older. And that's part of his sense of humor. Look, we're just the same. And we were very playful with my father. My father, he would speak baby talk, even as an adult. And the same ways that he spoke to us as children, my brother and I, we spoke to our children. So there was a real closeness amongst those generations. My father, who was known as Dick, Richard is his name, he once explained to a friend of his that I became a psychologist simply because of him. And I looked at him and, what do you mean? At the moment, I thought he was being self-denigrating, putting himself down. He was very proud. He said, this is who I am, this is my identity, and my son became a psychologist. At the time, I thought I became a psychologist because I was going to fix everything. More about that later. He was diagnosed in his 30s and 40s with bipolar 1 and suffered more from the diagnosis and the treatment than any real illness. Sometimes bedridden with depression for up to 3 weeks. He was immensely entertaining in his manic phases. He called these his highs. He loved them. I loved them. It was so much fun. We would go down the highway. In Canada, we have speed limits, not like in Germany, but we would ignore the speed limits. It would be very early in the morning, and we would go as fast as we could, and we would see if we could race the train. This was the gift of his mania. But then as I grew older, I learned that they were to be considered a sign of a severe mental illness and something to find embarrassing and shameful. And I was very disrespectful to my father, as many teens are, but probably more so than others, because I'd learned to stigmatize him. For a long time, I thought my father's brother, Bob, my Uncle Bob, I thought he was severely mentally delayed. In my late teens, I learned that he had lived most of his life in a famous institution in Montreal, the Douglas Institute, infamous, I should say, before being released in the early 60s. Well, no one ever told me he would have been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, is my guess. Deinstitutionalization and the very coercive antipsychotics at the time brought Uncle Bob back to live with my grandmother. His medications were so potent that it left him drooling and almost completely incapacitated, except for his gift of charcoal drawing and his endearing sense of humor, which I remembered. Next to my brother is my oldest son, Nathaniel, diagnosed with severe ADHD. He somehow managed to get through law school without accommodations. He feared the stigma. He said, who would want to hire a distracted lawyer who doesn't pay attention to details? He's an excellent writer, but grades that suffered because he didn't get them in on time. So his grades did not reflect his capability. But it appears lots of people will hire him. He's getting lots of work. On my far right, my sister Barbara, who will probably call me any minute now. She calls me every day. She's the middle sibling. She's had many diagnoses. The most successful diagnosis was paranoid schizophrenia. We were grateful to find medication that brought her stability without snuffing out who she is. That only happened in the last 10 years. While also diagnosed with severe learning disabilities and below average intelligence, she's a wizard at card games. And she is the most commonsensical in the family. So why am I sharing this with you? I spent most of my professional career trying to find ways to fix people, even today, to fix the system. I probably, before I heard some of the earlier presentations from peer specialists, from Will and Lisa, I had a different presentation. So you're probably not going to see the whole thing, because you all reminded me of some very fundamental things about how we need to build change. It's not to come with, here's the solution. And I called a non-for-profit company I founded Step Care Solutions, and I probably need to rethink that. Because nobody in my family needed fixing. It was me that needed to grow and to learn, to change, to see them for who they are. If only there'd been a recovery college for all of us, that our family, when I was growing up, I would have come to this much earlier, and I probably would have respected all of those in my life much earlier. So thank you for being patient with my story. Now, you maybe didn't come to hear that, and I actually, as I said, didn't plan to share that. But what I was invited to do was to talk a little bit about stepped care, and I think some of you would have heard from Timur earlier. Unfortunately, I didn't join that session because of my language disability. I would not have understood, so I chose not to attend. But stepped care is an umbrella term used to label any one of a wide variety of what could be considered shared care systems. So there are generally 3 or 4 different types of stepped care models. When a colleague of mine, when asked by others, what is this thing, stepped care 2.0? This colleague who knows my work, his reply was simply, it's not what you think it is. Okay, so what is it? Well, we'll get to that. It's not a progressive model, which you see on the left. A progressive model suggests, sometimes dictates, that people must begin with low-intensity care until that fails. And when that fails, you can get to the next step. Instead, it's preference-based. So what do you want? Very few people, as Matthias mentioned, are in that severe category that they can't actually make a choice. There's very few people, so why not allow people, show them the whole buffet of options, and you choose. And if you need guidance, we'll help you. So it's very preference-based. It's not a stratified model of care where people are assigned to a level based on the severity or intensity of their symptoms. Because the problem with that is we typically measure intensity of symptoms with a very limited, what I like to call, and no offense to Europeans, a Eurocentric model that is deficit-based, based in medicine, that only measures deficits. That's typically how people are triaged into higher intensity care. And who makes the decision? Quite often it's the medical expert says, well, we've assessed you using this tool and you must go this way. So instead, people get whatever works for them in that moment. This is the vision. It's based on their readiness. So people, when they, with the exception being people who are not asking for treatment, which is a small proportion of people with serious mental illnesses. Putting those aside, when people are asking for help, they're ready to do something. I was trained to help them get ready to do what I was trained to do. Instead, we need to build a system that gives them what they're already ready to do. So if my brother, who struggles with alcohol, doesn't want to admit that he has an alcohol problem, what's he ready to do? He might be ready to have an argument about that, so let's have some conversations. Might be ready for mental health literacy. It's also based on how much effort, time, and energy people have. So not only the people seeking care, but how much time, energy, and money does our community have to invest in programs? So it's an economic model as well. The economy of time, the economy of resources that are available to you and to your community. And it's also based on how much decision-making autonomy people have at the time of access. So the most common or well-known example of a progressive model, although it's changed over the years, is the UK version, which is part of the Increasing Access to Psychotherapies initiative, which has been considered by some as quite successful. People did get more access to psychotherapy, a fairly narrow type of psychotherapy, expert-driven CBT, which is only useful in my view. Well, scientists will tell you it is the evidence-based treatment. People with lived experience will say there's so many other things that are helpful. So whose evidence are we talking about? With stratified stepped care, which has become a popular model for branding or for guiding primary care referrals, people are sorted into groups, most commonly according to symptom severity. Some evidence indicates that stratified models are, while more expensive, they produce better outcomes than progressive models. The better outcomes are probably due to the screening programs that prioritize quick access for those with serious mental illness. So the promise is that more tailored, person-centered care, the promise with stratified models is that there will be more tailored, person-centered care. But I think this has really not been the reality. It's more been the same old care, nothing new, and typically not very collaborative or expansive. An emerging sophisticated version of stratified models is proposed based on precision medicine. This, in my opinion, is a pipe dream. We are not there yet to do precision medicine in psychiatry. Correct anyone who knows that we can do it and is successful. I'd be happy to hear from you. The science is only in the early stages, and should we, the science is really representing, in most cases, not wisdom, alternate forms of wisdom. It's one narrow branch of wisdom that comes from clinical trials, randomized clinical trials, which cut out all the qualitative wisdom that we have in the world. Here's an early version of a stratified model in the province of British Columbia, and I was speaking to Michael Durer, who's a psychiatric nurse. Michael, are you? Where? He's here, yeah, in Lucerne, and he said, well, I might come to visit Canada. This would be an interesting clinic system to visit in Canada called Foundry. They started off with a stratified model. They saw their errors. They saw the error of their ways when they talked to our group, and they moved from what was, as you look back here, just a screening and assessment system. They moved to one that is what we call open access. So walk in. Anybody can walk in anytime, whether severe mental illness, whether in crisis, whether just wanting to talk to someone. Same day access to everyone. And this is in about 30 sites across the province. The previous slide was the first place we implemented this model in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. And this included several options, not just early access through doorways, which is a walk-in clinic, but also e-mental health tools on a web platform that provided navigation through the system. You could talk to a nurse by dialing 811. You could talk to a peer support specialist at LifeWise, an organization run by peers. And all of this is organized like Timur's version in a circle. So sometimes we think of stepped cares along the steps, but that's not useful to most people. It makes more sense to organize care in a circle. Here's an example of a stepped care model based on Step Care 2.0 in the province, implemented across the province of Prince Edward Island. Anybody know Anne of Green Gables? No, that's a yes? Okay, yeah, that's what made Prince Edward Island famous. So this has recently been built, and you can see it looks different everywhere. So this is not a cookie cutter model. It looks, it should be co-designed with stakeholders in the community. This is one of my favorite representations from the Northern Territory, called the Northwest Territories in Canada. 50% of the population identifies as Indigenous. And they found this open access model. People familiar with single session or one at a time therapy? Hands up, anybody? Okay, so single session is a misnomer. It's popular in Italy, and it's popular in the United States and Australia. And it's based on the fact that the modal number of visits for any type of counseling or therapy is 1. So the frequency distribution, the mode is 1. And that we're really, really bad at predicting who will return for another session. So the idea is you want to pack in everything you can into a counseling session that you can, because it might be the last. And what happens is that practitioners have to be on their toes, because you're actually promising something helpful every session, as if it'll be the last. Well, of course, clients or patients love this, because we're working really hard. We're not falling into the trap that, well, it takes a long time for trust to build and the relationship to build. Yes, it could take a long time, but if you're really practicing well, you can align with somebody. If you're really well trained, you can align within seconds with somebody. The other thing about this model is that there's no assessment. We help first, ask questions later. Now, we do ask questions, but there's no assessment. There's no need to assess, because we ask the person. We trust that the person in front of us knows what they want to talk about, unless they don't. As opposed to most models, well, we have to go through our long intake form, and we know best what questions to ask, and we must diagnose you. There's a great place for diagnosis, but don't start with that. Start with what's top of mind for you, and we'll see where we get with that. It doesn't mean one and done, one at a time. You can come back. You can come back next week. You can come back in a few days. And many of my colleagues thought, how are you going to implement this? It'll be a tsunami of demand. There'll be people lining up. You won't be able to supply it. Never happened. And part of the reason we think is that because when you communicate to a community that this is available when you want it, there's a collective sigh of relief. Oh yeah, okay, I can go next week. I don't have to go today. And that's just one assumption for how that works, or why that works. So a little bit more about what it is, and I know we're running out of time, so I'll probably stop after this slide. This is an important one that shows that the model is not actually a model. It's a framework for designing your system. It's based on some guiding principles. I'll show that slide as well. And it's based on core components, core ingredients that you need to put into your co-design process in order to succeed. And there's also the steps come in to plan your system. And it's not something that you would show to showcase or to promote your programming, but it's a tool that helps you to see where you're going to allocate your resources. So just a few more slides, and then I'll stop. This is an example of the province of New Brunswick, and they used this graphic to plan their transformation. And on the y-axis, you can see health system stakeholder engagement. And that represents the effort, time, and expense required to build the programming. So as you go up to high acuity programming, that's expensive. And it serves a small proportion of the population. Not to say we shouldn't do it, but when you're planning your system, you need to think about where you're going to allocate your resources. On the lower steps, there's less effort required to reach more people. That's prevention. And so this helps you to start thinking about how you're going to measure success and see where the gaps in your system are. And you can also build in metrics to track. If we invest more in the lower steps, let's measure to see what the community wellness changes are from that investment, so that we can play around and test out, if we invest in the middle, what happens to the health of our community. On the x-axis, you see service intensity, and you see patient readiness, among other things. So as you go further along the x-axis, there has to be a readiness to invest in more complex care, a readiness to maybe go to an institution, a readiness to commit to difficult psychotherapy where you're going to be challenged. Many people are not ready for that. They're ready for something much simpler. Here are some of the principles of stepped care. I'm going to mention three. Number 3, all people have strengths and capacities. We often only ask what is wrong, not what is right. And in our assessment, if we do it, we make sure that we ask more questions about functioning and wellness than we do about deficits. Now, we can change course if it looks like a diagnosis will be useful. And it is useful for certain conditions, schizophrenia, bipolar, a few other things. But for most common mental disorders or people seeking help, a diagnosis does not actually inform treatment. The approaches for healing are not just restricted to people with training like me, but many people in our community already know how to support people with more common types of mental health problems, and we need to empower that. The core components are divided into care experiences and system design aspects. And so an example of a system feature is of course co-design. Nothing about us without us. That whatever community we've gone into, what we've found is we've got the most creativity out of people with lived experience and living expertise. And in fact, they're the ones that can promote the change. The biggest barrier to change we found are the professions, my own profession, psychiatry and other professions, because this is not how they were trained to practice. They were not trained to practice in this much more open way where they set aside their tools and just listen to what the person is saying they want. They're not trained to be as flexible. They're trained to use rigid treatment protocols. So I'm going to skip down now to a few places where it has been implemented. Actually, I want to share with you during the pandemic, the federal government of Canada invested in a portal called Wellness Together Canada that was based on the stepped care model. And you can see here, you could get counseling, talk, and any of these things were immediately available within minutes. Anyone in Canada could talk to a counselor 24/7. They did not actually, there was no tsunami of demand. Most people went to the other options, whether it be peer support or things that they could do on their own. So if you lay out a system like this, people won't necessarily go to the most expensive. And then I want to finish with some of the impact. So here's the province of New Brunswick after they implemented these. This is the change in wait times for adults and youth, adults in blue, youth in yellow. Across the whole province, the wait times went down. At where I work, UC Berkeley, here's the change in wait times. There was a differential between what people were waiting for, ongoing counseling, or the just access to a walk-in. But the wait times went way down, and then satisfaction went up. So we thought when people transitioned from something that they thought they could get their 10 sessions of therapy to this one-at-a-time model, that satisfaction would go down, but in fact it went way up. Also, the extent to which people's identities were acknowledged went up. They felt that their identities were acknowledged because there were no assumptions made about what sort of treatment they should get, and they could come in and base the treatment plan on something that they know works for their cultural identity. We did learn a lot through the implementation, and there's 2 books out on Step Care 2.0. The second one, called The Power of Conundrums, I was thinking of some of the things that Will Hall, that sometimes it's the disagreements that have power, and we don't always have to agree with what the right course of action is. And as we implemented this model, we found while it produced solutions, it also produced a lot more quandaries that had to be developed. And those quandaries allowed communities to start to work together with their conflicting views on what would support a more effective system. Last slide. I know. So this is the concept that is really important, Step Care 2.0. We live, most of us, in a capitalist world that's based on a paradigm of scarcity. And so what is rare or scarce is highly valued and expensive. I'm expensive, psychiatrists are expensive. We're very important in the system, but we're a small part. But this principle is based on ancient wisdom, indigenous wisdom. A healing circle, everyone who comes to the healing circle has a gift to bring. My father had a gift to bring, my brother has a gift to bring. Whether we have deficits or not, we all have some healing to offer. So Step Care 2.0 opens up system design to include all partners and all communities with different opinions for what would work. And this structure, if you look at it, geodesic dome, each piece is very simple and on its own does very little. But if arranged in this way, it can be one of the most powerful structures of all. So that's what we're doing with Step Care 2.0, is we're inviting people to come in with all the abundant resources. That's the synergy model. There's resources, healing resources aren't scarce, they're abundant. You have to call them in and build them, build a framework that holds all options and makes them easily accessible. Dank.